Hey there. Today I want to talk about the atonement and why I think it's one of the big weaknesses in Christianity. And it's the most fundamental concept there is in Christianity. It is literally Christianity is the atonement. And I think it's always been a weakness, and I want to make a video to show the way that I think about it and hopefully make the problems I have a little bit clearer and present a way to think about it. So, on my view, any explanation, any theory of atonement you would have, you'd want it to have these four things. You want it to be intuitively good. You'd want it to be orthodox, you'd want it to be non-trivial, and you'd, of course, want it to be logical. Intuitively good. By that I mean, you'd want a non-Christian on the street who's never been to church to hear what you have to say about the atonement and go, oh, yeah, that's a good, that's a noble, great thing. Orthodox. It can't be heretical. I don't mean Greek Orthodox. I just mean it cannot be heretical. It has to be orthodox. Non-trivial. We don't just want the atonement to be some little thing like, Jesus did it because he was feeling like it. Where I want it to be Christians want it to be meaningful and deep and probably have to do with eternal destiny. And finally, logical. This one's a given, right? We want our theory of atonement to make sense. So, my thesis is that every theory of atonement runs afoul on one of these, at least one of them. And I think that's the big weakness of Christianity. There is no atonement theory that checks all these boxes. And in fact, I think there are hints to this in Christianity, but we'll get to that later. Let's just go through some of these. So, the first one we have is the satisfaction/penal substitution theory. Right? These are satisfaction, penal substitution are slightly different, but I'm just putting them together here. Thesis: Jesus Christ dies to satisfy God's wrath against human sin. Jesus is punished in place of the sinners in order to satisfy the justice of God and the legal demand of God to punish sin. So, as you can see, I think this runs afoul of being intuitively good. And I think if you put it into human terms, it seems very strange. It seems very odd, right? There's this being, this powerful person, let's say a king, and he demands that all his citizens do these certain commands, live this certain way, and every single one of them fails at it. And so the king decides to kill himself to satisfy himself. Or if you think of it in terms of a kid, his kid says, hey, listen, Dad, I will die for everyone. And the dad says, okay, that'll work. Right? Both of those ways of looking at it don't really seem intuitively good. And I completely understand that how a Christian would respond to this, who defends this theory, is they're going to try and change the metaphor slightly, and they're going to try and tweak it and say, well, what if the kid was, XYZ? But fundamentally, there's a concept here of setting up a standard and then letting yourself satisfy it. And it's like, okay, well, why didn't you just, why did you need that? Right? Why is it that God was able to put a standard in place and then he needed himself to fulfill it? It's like, couldn't he have just dropped the standard? Right? So that's the first critique of this, I would say, is that it seems almost like if God's standard was arbitrary, and that he could just not have the standard. Like he could just say, I forgive everyone. And the second thing is that the idea of Jesus being able to take our legal punishment doesn't seem right either. It doesn't seem like if, for example, let's say someone committed a murder, it doesn't seem like they could have a family member come take that punishment for them and the murderer could go free. That doesn't seem right. So those are the two critiques. The first one is that why couldn't God have just forgiven everyone? It doesn't seem like a good thing. It seems arbitrary and kind of malicious for him to have not forgiven everyone, but instead forced someone to suffer. And the second one is, it doesn't seem ethical or right that an innocent person could take the punishment for a guilty person and that guilty person could get off free. That doesn't seem right. So, again, what a Christian would have to do here is they're going to have to change both of those metaphors to be more complex, and they're going to say, well, you got to understand when it's God, things are different, that kind of thing. In the end, I don't think it works. Luckily, there are more theories. Moral influence theory. Jesus Christ came and died in order to bring about positive change to humanity. This moral change comes through the teachings of Jesus alongside his examples and actions. I hear this when I talk to people who are kind of more progressive Christians. Maybe they're like young millennial Christians who are into meditation. They'll kind of give me this thing. Well, no, there's, hell, schmel. Jesus was a good example. And I think this works. I think it's intuitively good. There's nothing heretical about it. It seems logical enough. It just seems trivial, though. There were already tons of good examples on how to live your life. My mom is someone who's an amazing example of how to live your life. And so it just seems like a trivial thing. Okay, moving on. The ransom theory. Now, this one runs afoul of the logical requirement. The ransom theory is that Adam and Eve sold humanity over to the devil at the time of the fall. Hence, justice required that God pay the devil a ransom, for the devil did not realize that Christ could not be held in the bonds of death. Again, when you try and map this to a real-world metaphor, it starts to fall apart, right? If first of all, why would God allow Adam and Eve to sell their humanity and let that be a legal requirement that he would uphold? If God is the one making the laws, it seems to me that he is free to just say, oh, well, I'm not going to uphold that legally, right? I mean, the way I think about it is there are certain contracts that you're not allowed to do in the U.S. You can't sell your body via contract. You can't contract that I'm going to be your slave for the next 5 years. That's not legally binding because no legal authority will uphold that. So why would God uphold Adam and Eve selling their humanity? That just seems like an odd thing. And it's not free will. It's just God is the law. God has to uphold something for it to be legal, right? That's the first critique. It just seems weird that God would do that, right? It doesn't really make sense. The second sentence here is very telling. Justice required that God pay the devil a ransom. Again, here we're starting to get, what does it mean? What is justice? If justice is this force outside of God, then we're no longer orthodox. But if justice is God's choice, then this sentence can be replaced with God required that God pay the devil a ransom. In which case, it's just what? What does that even mean? The third critique of this I would give is that the punchline of the ransom theory is that God, gives the devil Jesus, here, take Jesus, and then Jesus, turns out, escapes after 3 days. So it's okay, well, if God was going to play along at the beginning and act like he was really giving the devil a ransom, but in the end he, backs out of the deal, why did he play along in the first place? If he's willing to not play by the rules, why did he pretend to play by the rules? Right? Just seems to be illogical. I don't actually know many people who defend this. I know people who defend this. I know people who defend this. I don't know people who defend this. It just seems very difficult to imagine what it could mean for the devil to hold people at ransom, and God, it's tricky. I would say Christ as victor is a similar ball here, right? In this theory, Jesus Christ dies in order to defeat the powers of evil, in order to free mankind from their bondage. Okay. Seems like God could defeat the powers of evil by snapping. Why he didn't do that? Unclear. The second critique of this is when you get to a robust understanding of what it means for free will to exist, it starts to get tricky to know what it could mean for God to free mankind from their bondage, right? Like, what does that mean? If people have free will, it seems like they already are free from bondage because they can make any choices they want. But maybe what someone would say is, well, before Jesus died, people weren't really truly free because they couldn't make good choices, or they were forced to make bad choices, or their nature was such that they'd make bad choices. And then I would ask, well, like, why is that a thing? Right? Like, why would God allow free will to be corrupted like that? It seems odd. And of course there's explanations like, oh, well, the fall. But I think when you dig into that, it also doesn't make sense. And like, what does it mean to defeat sin, death, and the devil? Like, what does it mean to defeat sin? Like, if you have free will, you can sin. But if you defeat sin, can you still sin? Do you still have free will? What does it mean to defeat death? And why did Jesus need to do this to defeat death? Again, it feels like there's some power outside of God, and he is defeating it. But that can't be what this means. Right? There's a power outside of God, and the only way he can defeat it is to do X, Y, Z. But that's a heretical statement to say that there's a power outside of God, and there was only one way he could deal with it. Right? Christ is victor. I just don't think it works. This one I made up because I want to give an example of how you can actually solve all these if you go into heretical views. I call this Just God, Merciful Jesus. It's based off the story in Genesis where Abraham negotiates with God to save Sodom and Gomorrah. He says, God, listen, if there's... God is about to destroy it, right? God's about to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham says, God, what if there's 100 righteous people? Would you really destroy it? And God goes, no, okay, you're right. If there's 100 righteous people, I won't destroy it. And then Abraham, like a good negotiator, goes, okay, well, I mean, what about 50? Is 50 enough? And God goes, yeah, there's 50. And then Abraham whittles it down, blah, blah. But the pattern, the plain reading of this is that God has this sort of strict, unmerciful view and justice, and he's gonna do it no matter what. And Abraham steps in and makes a deal, and I think that that works logically. That Jesus effectively came in and made a deal with God and said, "Listen, I know you're mad or not mad. I know you demand sacrifice, and I know that you want to destroy all these people, but let's make a deal. Let's negotiate on this. Just destroy me for 3 days, and then we'll be good." But again, this doesn't work, or it's not orthodox because it takes away Jesus and God being the same person. It makes a distinction between God, like it makes a weird distinction where Jesus is merciful but God's not. It doesn't work for a variety of reasons, but I think it is intuitively good. It's non-trivial and it's logical, but it's heretical. Now, I think that's all my slides. Yeah. So, on a wider level, I think that generally, as a rule of thumb, when you have a bunch of different explanations for something, it's not easy to explain, right? And furthermore, I would say it might not even be possible to explain. It might just be something people are desperately trying to hold up. But I think about a couple things. One is I think about, in Mormonism, there's this problem with geography, and it has to do with the Hill of Gomorrah, and it has to do with where people landed, and it's very tricky, and there's a bunch of different ways to deal with it. And what Mormons will often say is, this isn't a problem. Look, there's 5 or 6 different ways to deal with it. Choose your own. And, the fact of the matter is that the reason they have 5 or 6 different explanations is because none of them are free from major problems. So they keep having to come up with explanations and have people try and defend them and try and stretch them further. And maybe this time we'll get this explanation past the finish line. And again, I think you see this pattern when there's not a good explanation. In Mormonism, if you believe that Mormonism is false, you're going to say, yeah, the reason there's a geography discrepancy is because when Joseph Smith wrote it, he got the geography wrong. And so there's no good explanation, so you have to have 5 or 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 different theories. Contrast that with something like, Christians agree God's omnipotent and all-loving. Right? Done. We don't need 7 or 8 different theories on God's nature. That's good. That makes sense. I agree. Simple. Right? There's not 15 different theories that are all up for debate. Another example of this is, I remember when Rachel, if you guys remember, there was this lady named Rachel Dolezal who came out as trans black. She was born white, but she said she identified as black. And I naively thought that she would be accepted. I didn't see any, it seemed to me that the rule or the methodology used was people can be whatever they want. So if you want to be transgender, you can. If you want to be trans black, you can. But to my surprise, she was rejected by all the people who were pro transgenderism, and I was really curious why, because I clearly was missing something. And I Googled, why can't Rachel Dolezal be trans black? And I looked at the top 10 articles on Google, and every single one of them had a different explanation. And what that said to me was, this means that there really is no good explanation, and people are doing it for non-logical reasons, or they're doing it for certain reasons that they don't want to reveal. And in that case, I think it was probably something like Rachel Dolezal being able to be trans black in some way messes up like some of the other logical rules of the system and maybe exposes something that makes it seem illogical. So people have to make it not possible, and they come with a bunch of theories. What I'm trying to say here is that anytime there are like 8 or 9 different theories on something, that either means you're waiting on new information, new experiments, which is totally fine, or it means that it probably doesn't make sense, right? I think that things fall into those 2 categories, and I think in this case, it's because it doesn't make sense. So you have to have a bunch of different stuff. In fact, William Lane Craig did an interview, I'll put the link below with a timestamp, with Cameron Bertuzzi of Capturing Christianity, who's great, by the way, shouts out. And William Lane Craig says, he just wrote a book on the Atonement, and in it he lays out, like I did, a bunch of different theories, and he says in that interview, he says, well, listen, here's how I think about the Atonement. I think about the Atonement like a beautiful gem, right? And this beautiful gem has like all these different sides to it, all these different flat surfaces, and they're all part of one gem, but but all those surfaces together come together and create this beautiful gem. And I think that's very telling. Him saying that seems to me to be saying, listen, none of these theories actually work, but maybe if we just stack a bunch together, it'll be overwhelming, and everyone will find something that they like a little bit, and it'll all work out. But again, I think the reason you need 7 or 8 theories is because every single one of them runs afoul. I think if you had one that didn't run afoul, that would be the one, right? Final thing I want to talk about here is which of these people might have a problem with, which of these criteria, right? Because I came up with these criteria. This isn't something the church has put forth. The first one is people may have a problem with my criteria that it has to be intuitively good. They may say something like, well, couldn't your moral intuitions just be incorrect because we live in a fallen world? To which I would say, sure, but then when you tell a non-believer that God is good, then you know that their definition of good is different than yours. So isn't that kind of dishonest? Right? Isn't it kind of dishonest to tell someone something is good while you know your definition of good is different? The metaphor I think about is, imagine if there was a car dealership and the manager comes in one day and calls in all the salespeople for a meeting, and he says, listen, everyone, I've been reading about the definitions of words and the philosophy of language, and I've realized that there's actually a definition of free that makes more sense than the current definition, right? The current definition doesn't cost anything, but there's this new definition. I think it makes sense, and it's what is free? Well, free means to do something that the value of doing that thing is so exceeds the cost that it's just overwhelming, right? Because nothing's really free, right? You have to walk over to get it. You have to breathe, don't you? That's a cost. So free just means that the value outweighs it. And so really, if you think about it, our cars are free because the value of buying them so outweighs the trivial monetary cost that I think this really is the definition of free. Okay, great. They put up a bunch of billboards across town saying free cars, free cars, free cars. People come in, they say, this is amazing. The cars are really free. The salespeople say, yes, the cars are really 100%. I promise you, they're free. And they go, wow, that's amazing. Go for a test drive. They spend all day at the dealership picking out their car. And then they go, okay, that was great. And the car dealer goes, okay, that'll be $28,000. And they go, oh, you said it was free. The car dealer goes, I see. You have a really bad definition of free. Listen, your definition of free is wrong. So, that's obviously super dishonest, right? If you know your definition of a word is different than the people you're using it with, you have to deal with that. If you know that your definition of God's goodness is so dramatically different than people's definition of good, and you tell them God is good, that's dishonest. Use a different word. Say, God is the source of morality. Maybe that's what you mean. But when you say good, certain things come with it in our modern culture. So that'd be my first, that'd be my response to the criticism that God doesn't have to be intuitive. The theory does not have to be intuitively good. Non-trivial. If you want to say the atonement could be non-trivial, I'm fine with that. I don't have an issue. I don't have a response to that. I just think this is something most Christians would not want to. I think most Christians would want it to be non-trivial, but logical. Again, maybe a Christian would say like, well, the thoughts of God are not the thoughts of men. I don't know. If you want to say that it can be non-logical, whatever, I don't really have an issue with that. I think most Christians would want to say it should be logical, and of course, Orthodox. Again, if you want to be heretical, I think you're actually good to go. So you could make an argument that maybe the Orthodox heretic distinction was not led by God, and they went astray, and yada yada, and then I think you can make this work. So that's it. Thanks for watching.